It's long been said that the rich only get richer and the poor only get poorer. With us for some perspective on how wealth is or is not shared in our society, let's welcome from furthest away to closest to our studio, as is our custom, starting in Montreal, Quebec, with Allison Christians. She's professor and chair of tax law at McGill University. In our nation's capital, Shaban, principal economist and co-founder of the economic consulting firm Vivic Research. And in Dundas, Ontario, Michael Veall. He's a professor and academic director at McMaster University's Statistics Canada Research Data Centre. And it's great to welcome you three back to TVO tonight here on the agenda. Let's just put sort of the premise of the book that we have been talking about earlier in the program to you three. And I'll get your first impressions on the concept that it's not that one nation in a global economy wins or loses depending on the rise or fall of a nation's economy, but that the people from different socioeconomic groups benefit or lose depending on what's happening in the global economy, and that we really should, according to the author, be rethinking the world along those lines. Allison, start us off. What do we think?
Yeah, I have to agree with this idea. I mean, we have one global economy that links up wealth across countries and makes it possible for business owners and capital owners in one state to exploit, use, correspond with the surpluses available in other states. And so that means that those who own the means of wealth production have a lot more in common with each other through those global supply chains than maybe they have with their own domestic populations.
So the thinking, Robin, is that a billionaire in China has a lot more in common with a billionaire in the United States, as opposed to an upper middle class American having more in common with a middle class American. You buying that?
Yeah. And I mean, to the middle class point too, I think that there are striking similarities between middle class people in Canada and middle class people elsewhere. I was looking into a recent OECD report that is studying the middle class across OECD countries. And there are striking similarities. About 20% of middle income households across the OECD spend more than they earn. We're seeing a decline in the middle class. And, you know, as a millennial and an economist, I'm acutely aware of how these trends are impacting people in my generation, both in terms of economic mobility, income inequality, and access to affordable housing.
Michael, where are you on this premise?
So I think it's a very worthwhile book. The core idea here is that Chinese elites, by forcing down the consumption of their workers, they create a surplus, and they sell that surplus or they trade that surplus for financial assets, buying them from the United States and other countries. And so therefore the elites in the United States are selling and the Chinese elites are buying, and of course that's in their mutual interest. Well, meanwhile, on the workers' side, Chinese workers' consumption's being forced down. So today, for example, the current trading dispute involving Canada and China is the furniture dispute. Just came up. Basically what's going on is that Chinese workers aren't being left enough income to buy the furniture. It's being put onto the world market, and that's squeezing out the market for example, Canadian furniture producers.
Robin, I guess if we're going to take this to the next step, it requires people to think of themselves in a different way. That is to say, don't most people at the moment think of themselves as, when they think of the world, well, I'm a Canadian first. They don't think of themselves as, I'm in the middle class first. They think I'm Canadian, I'm Chinese, I'm American. Is that something you think needs to change?
Yeah, I was reflecting on this before this conversation. And I think what happens is we watch the news, right? And we see a lot of human rights issues when it comes to workers, right? Something that I've always been interested in is garment workers in particular, and the Rana Plaza disaster that happened several years back. And so we hear these sensational stories of human rights abuses, and we think, well, that doesn't happen here. We're in Canada. But again, when you go back to the data and you do a comparison of income, in particular for those folks in the middle of the income distribution, we're seeing a lot more similarities than differences in our economic lives. Back to this topic of housing, right? And just general affordability of life. across OECD countries, we've seen the cost of housing grow 3 times faster than the median income of households. And so the crunches that we are experiencing here in Canada, again, for people of my income bracket and generation, these are also happening elsewhere. And I think it's something that gets overlooked a lot when we're hearing about economic news, beyond Canada's borders.
When we think of the world, though, Michael, it is going to presumably require a massive cultural change not to think of ourselves, when we think of the world, as Canadians first, but rather to somehow think of ourselves as, let's say, I'm a middle-class Canadian. I really feel a great kinship with my Chinese counterpart, who's a middle-class Chinese person living in Beijing. Are we capable of that kind of mindset change?
Well, I don't think we should. I think we should also recognize that there are competing interests. I mean, one of the things, of course, is that a Chinese worker would be acutely aware of is that, as Matthew Klein said, Chinese workers are a lot poorer. We try to preserve our higher standard of living in this very complex world. The issue is whether to what extent do we try to do this with trade policy? And in general, I don't believe we should. I do believe that we should try to maintain our position in the world by something closer to free trade. But as these authors point out, the income inequality problem is also part of this.
Well, let me pick up on that with Allison, because ever since Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, was released about 4 years ago, people have been talking about income inequality in a much more significant way, and how the top 1% of income earners have a much disproportionately higher share of the world's total wealth than the other 99%. So let's say a decade later, have we made any progress on that problem?
No, we're going in the wrong direction, I think, and the coronavirus has just amplified that inequality problem on a global scale. And I think that's worrisome, not only because, as the other speakers have noted, it has left some Canadians behind and maybe confused us about what we think where the problems of our society come from and how much control we think we have over them. So I think that Piketty, he talks about the historical trends of wealth and gives us a warning as to what happens when you get too much wealth concentration. And the Matthew Klein and Michael Pettit's book amplifies that and shows us that we aren't thinking correctly about whether we can solve these problems and how. We think this is a trade issue and this is about balance of payments or terms of trade, but actually it's a lot more about our central core decision to be an open market, a free market in an open economy, in a globalized economy that we can't control. And so when China allows consumers surplus to be swept up into production and not into consumer spending, that Chinese workers are hurt by that, but so are Canadian workers. And we don't control China's policies any more than we control the US, but we're affected in different ways by both of those countries.
Michael, I wonder if you'd weigh in on that as well. There seems to be a consensus that we have, despite 10 years of considerable discussion, maybe going back as far as Occupy Wall Street and so on, after a decade of very focused conversation on what to do about the 1%, that we haven't seemed to make any progress at all. In fact, things may have gotten worse. Why is that?
Hard problem to solve. I think that we have tried to redistribute, but at a certain point, it becomes harder and harder to do that because the mechanisms against redistribution, essentially behavior of the people who get taxed more, can change more and more. So it's just a difficult problem for us to solve. I don't think we should think of ourselves as being a society that doesn't do a lot in that direction, but to do more and more gets harder and harder.
Robin, do you think it is the role and responsibility of governments around the world to redistribute wealth?
Yeah, I think redistribution is an important factor in all of this, but I think redistribution can happen on multiple levels. There's the tax and transfer redistribution that I think we're very comfortable with, but there's also the distribution of economic opportunity and economic access. And for me, a lot of what we're talking about here really boils down to concentrations in corporate power and trends that we're seeing towards more concentrated industries and economies. And this is critical as a trend because it can be a major driver of the inequality that we're seeing today. And this is because as our economies become more concentrated, they become increasingly dominated by a smaller number of bigger firms. And when these firms are in a dominant position, they're better able to extract wealth and income from people lower down on the income distribution and redistribute that wealth and income up to the wealthiest. And in this way, we're seeing a real mechanism of inequality at play. And what is so interesting about this problem is that there are solutions. One of the solutions that we should be exploring is making tougher competition laws that not only control and rein in dominance of firms, but also in that process, providing more opportunities for people to participate in the economy as entrepreneurs, as workers receiving fair wages. And in that way, we can help ameliorate the rise of inequality that we're seeing.
Well, Allison, I know how much you love tax law. You love it so much that I think you have a mug somewhere on your desk that proves how much you love it. As she reaches for it now and shows us, Isis, there we go. Okay. So we know how much you love tax law. I can imagine people watching this or listening to this right now saying to themselves, look, this should be an easy problem to solve. All the Western governments simply need to get together and say, we're going to raise corporate taxes by this much. We're going to raise taxes on the super rich that much. If we all do it together, nobody has an unfair advantage. Boom, let's just do it. Why not?
Yeah, easy. Sure. Yeah, that's not going to happen. And why? Because not everybody loves tax law. In fact, most people really hate tax law, and for lots of good reasons, I suppose. But one of the main reasons that people think that this is not a good idea is that they worry that we're not going to be redistributing in the right way, or we're going to waste our money or something like this, or all kinds of ideologies about why we shouldn't have taxes on the rich, or we shouldn't raise taxes here or there or from corporations. I mean, the short answer is that there is a global discussion taking place about the level of corporate tax and the distribution of corporate tax, which may or may not change, what's going on here in Canada. But the book that we've read for today, that tells us that trade wars are class wars, I think could have an extra line, which are tax wars. Class wars are tax wars. They always have been. It's always a battle of vested interests, as the book talks about them. People like the way things are when it works out for them, and they don't want it to change. And for those for whom the system is not working, agitating for change is working against some pretty strongly held beliefs and some very strong vested interests. So it's not that easy to change, even though, yes, 100% that is what we should do. We should be lowering taxes on consumers, getting more spending ability in regular households, lowering income taxes for workers, and raising them for those with higher incomes and in capital.
All right, Robin, I was being somewhat facetious before, Robin, when I said we should simply snap our fingers, get all the Western countries together to agree on this, and voila, it's going to be done. But can I get you on the record right now as to whether or not you think if we could, would that in fact be the way to go in order to ameliorate this situation of the top 1% having such a disproportionate share of the world's wealth?
Well, again, I want to come back to this idea that it's not just about the distribution of money today and being able to snap our fingers and reallocate money to different people. It's also about creating an economy that at its core is more equitable. And this comes down to having equitable access to economic opportunities. And policies of various types can play into this, not only labor market policies, which enable people to participate in labor markets and earn a living, but also to broader economic policies. Again, the drum I love to beat is competition policy. This is my obsession. And when we have an economy that is dynamic, that is not dominated by overbearing corporate interests, entrepreneurs can enter the economy. They can create new businesses, create wealth for themselves, and also provide more opportunities for workers. Right now, along with this trend of inequality, we're seeing a trend towards greater corporate concentration. And we're seeing this not only in Canada, but around the world. And the problem with this trend is that it creates what economists call market power. The ability of corporations, which generally are held by the wealthiest in our society, to take income from workers, to take income from consumers for their own interest. And so if we can address market power in our societies, we can actually go a long way in addressing inequality. Again, I'm going to point to another OECD report that found that for the poorest 20% of people in Canada, if we could wave a magic wand and get rid of excess market power in our economy, their incomes could increase by as much as 20%. In contrast, the top 1% of earners, if we could wave a magic wand and get rid of excess market power in our economy, their wealth could reduce by as much as 24%. So it's not just about what people have today and how we split the pie. It's about creating a system where everyone can have access to economic opportunity, and we don't have certain individuals who tend to be wealthiest creating a game for themselves so that they can extract wealth from other people. And again, I'll bring it back to the point I said before, which is we have a policy solution for this, and it's competition policy. And competition policy is about creating a dynamic environment where we don't have single overbearing dominant firms controlling the economic rules of the game and creating inequality.
Sounds to me, from the way you've described that we ought to spend our time looking for that magic wand, because if we could find it, that would really solve all our problems, wouldn't it? Anyway, Michael, let me get you to weigh in on this issue. Do you think it would be advisable to raise taxes on the super rich and on corporations in order to address the issues we've been talking about tonight?
Certainly on the super rich, I think the corporations is a more complex issue. But I do agree with what Robin just said about equality of opportunity. I'd like to point out that when you look at the numbers, the chances of a kid born to poor parents in Canada of moving up the income scale are actually pretty high by world standards. It's certainly, it's imperfect, but it's pretty high, up to about the same standards as the Scandinavian countries. What I think we have our problem looking forward is that that's largely based on our education system and our healthcare system. And as we think about COVID and other things, that's probably going to be under threat as governments become in more and more straitened situations financially.
Allison, let me get you to address one of the issues that Matthew Klein talked about in his book, and that being the wealth that is concentrated at the top is wealth that, considering the size of it and how much heft it has, actually doesn't create that much bang for the buck. It doesn't create the number of jobs that you'd think that kind of wealth should or ought to. Is that true or false?
I agree with the authors of the book. That's true. And part of the reason that's true is because the way you get that kind of wealth is by suppressing wages and consumer power. And when you suppress wages and consumer power, then there's less demand for the goods and services that the companies are providing. And when there's less demand, then that's what is creating, kind of a glut of those goods and services that people can't afford. And so when people can't afford them, then who are we selling that stuff to? That problem is kind of the big picture of that book, that if we do not solve this problem of consumers being squeezed in order to make money for the 1%, if we don't solve that problem, then we're in a spiral. And it's really hard to solve that problem because once you give that much money and power to the wealthy, they don't want to give it up.
Well, okay, Michael, I know we think of ourselves as an independent country, we Canadians, but the fact of the matter is we share a pretty long border with the most powerful economy in the world and have for a very long time. And therefore, is there anything we can truly do about this in Canada if the United States doesn't want to come along for the ride?
I think that it limits us. Sometimes I think we need to remember that what goes on in Washington in terms of our economy can be at least as important as what goes on in Ottawa. And so we do have to keep track of American developments. And I've shown in some of my own work that one of the drivers of Canadian income inequality has in fact been US income inequality, both in part because, for example, our high income CEOs, they have the option of going to work in the United States. And so what happens is their services get bid up in price. And also, of course, perhaps we sometimes mimic American culture in this matter as well. And our institutions are more likely to pay high salaries at the top, partly because we see the United States doing the same thing. So I do think it matters, our closeness to the United States. I think we can move a little around the edges, but I think it's always a limiting factor. Whatever the United States does matters for our policies.
Robin, maybe you can pick up on that. And I know the answer to this question must seem obvious, but let's put it on the record anyway. Why does what's happening in Washington and in the capitals of the United States play such a huge role in what we're able to or want to do in this country?
Well, I think, again, one of the obvious answers to that is that we as an economy are really integrated with the economy of the US. We have the US as our major trade partner. We also rely a lot on the US for foreign direct investment in order to grow our economy. But what I want to highlight here is that there are things that we can do within our own borders today to address these issues. Yeah, we are dependent on the policies implemented elsewhere, and this does create policy complexities, but there are low-hanging fruit that we can be pursuing. And I've talked about this before on the show, but again, when it comes back to our competition policy, our antitrust laws, we have such weak laws in this country that explicitly allow for business practices that move income and wealth from the lower end of the spectrum to the wealthiest. I've talked about a classic merger case that happened in the 90s between two propane distribution companies. This merger is legal under our law, and it allowed for the creation of 16 monopolies for the sale of propane across Canada, which led to a price increase in propane, which is a necessary good for many people for heating their homes, a price increase of 8%, a wealth transfer of $40 million from consumers to the owners of the merged company per year, and $20 million in cost savings, which is equivalent to 200 job losses. So we have these mechanisms within our competition law that allow for this stuff to happen, that allow for inequality to be created. Another major problem that we have with our competition laws is that, unlike in other countries, it's not illegal for businesses to full out conspire with one another to suppress wages. And I'm talking about sitting in smoking rooms, conspiring. And this is what we saw, in a way with the hero pay fiasco between Sobeys, Metro, and Loblaw. Other countries have these sorts of rules as a stop measure. There's obviously more that needs to be done, but I mean, we got to deal with our own backyard first.
Let's talk more about what's going on in our backyard. Michael, there was the case as well of the giant supermarkets conspiring on bread prices for years and years and years. Why is it that our governments apparently seem prepared to allow a lot of that stuff to go on without doing anything about it?
Well, it's harder to stop than it looks. I mean, even back in Adam Smith, you can read about the problem of firms conspiring with each other. And perhaps Robin's right. Perhaps there's more we can do. But I think again, it is one margin. There are other margins of policy that perhaps we can do more on, say, the taxation side. But we do also have to remember that as a relatively small country, our markets tend to be small. We're also spread out. Our markets tend to be localized. And these are the things that make competition policy a little bit harder.
All right, Allison, let's pick up on that. We have the example of antitrust. That's something we could do within our borders that we don't need to get agreement with the United States government on. We could do that ourselves. What else could we do, the so-called low-hanging fruit, that would not necessarily disadvantage our companies here? Because you know what they say, if you raise taxes on them too much here, they'll just leave and go somewhere else. What could we do, though, to deal with these issues?
Yeah, I think we do have to think about what are the immediate things that we could spend on in Canada to make it possible for consumers, workers to spend more in our economy and build inward inside the market. And those are things I think that tax policy can influence. I would say in the big picture, it's high time that we started asking what the externalized costs are of all kinds of corporate behavior and behavior by the wealthy, investment behavior, and start internalizing or pricing those externalities. That's not actually that hard to do, or at least not as hard to do as it used to be, but it's just sort of a new thing. We haven't really done enough of that, and we need to do it. And I'm not talking about carbon taxes. I'm talking about more understanding that corporate books and records are reflecting profits which are unsustainable and built on externalities. And if we were pricing those in, maybe earnings reports would be more accurate. And then on the more local, you talked about, you know, Canada being dispersed and having local areas that need attention. I think things that Canada should be doing right now include the improvement of water across Canadian communities everywhere. I mean, it's just something that just would improve the lives and make it possible for people to spend less time working on boiling water and more time on productive activities in the economy. So at any point where we see a lack of infrastructure or something that's been neglected, spending in those areas will have economic impact, you know, well beyond kind of any corporate tax cut or any kind of measure that's going to try to, you know, boost, you know, the 1% in the hopes of trickle down. We need to start trickling, you know, up. And the way to sort of trickle up is to spend on those obvious infrastructure areas. So clean water is like just an obvious one, and internalizing negative externalities is another obvious one. But again, you need to understand, we all need to understand that when we think of these things as local, they're not local, they're global in nature. So we have to think about those problems as being, you know, there are some steps that we take that are domestic and local, and some of those have to be in the international fabric, including in, for example, the international tax rules.
Michael, I heard an expression used there by Allison, and I want to follow up with you on that, because 40 years ago or so, when Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, we heard a lot about trickle-down economics. The idea being that if you make companies wealthy and rich people wealthier, that they will hire people, create jobs, and the economic benefits will trickle down to everybody below them. Do we agree now that that theory really holds no water?
Well, I mean, to some extent, that's the way our economy works. And what we're wanting to do is to augment that with redistribution policy. To some extent, we do that, and we've been talking about ways that we can perhaps do that better. I don't want to leave the impression that, you know, here in Canada, there's nothing we can do. What we want to do is to make ourselves collectively more productive, and particularly those at the lower end of the income spectrum, so that they claim higher resources just because they are more productive. But we also wish to augment that with redistribution. And I think it's clear that without redistribution, we won't achieve an acceptable level of income distribution in Canada.
I don't mean to be a smart aleck about this, but if you're a single mother with a couple of kids whose job has been adversely affected because of this pandemic, how do you get more productive?
Sure. I mean, I think we're talking about the society as a whole, because if there's more, then there's more to redistribute. So, for example, you want a more efficient tax system. Allison was talking about things like the provision of water and the provision of public services. We want to do those better than we're doing them now. We always have to strive to get better, because that's the way we increase our prosperity, and we make our prosperity more inclusive.
Robin, I know you're not necessarily a political scientist. You're more on the economic side of things, but it feels as if we're not going to get some of these ideas into place unless the political leadership of the country kind of wakes up and wants to do it. What odds are you putting on that?
I mean, I'm hopeful, I think, because, I'm seeing greater awareness of these issues. I think people are interested in talking about them. And I think that, as time goes on, the pressure is building. I think that folks are, increasingly becoming impatient, especially with the announcement of the Rogers-Shaw deal, which no doubt is another example of a redistribution mechanism. If this deal goes through, prices for mobile prices are very likely to go up. And Rogers and Shaw are owned by two of the wealthiest families in Canada. And I think that folks are beginning to understand that it's not enough just to have redistribution. But again, back to what I was saying before, it's about having a fair economy. And it's, I push back a little bit on Michael's comment that, yes, it's about increasing productivity, but if we don't have equitable distribution of power within the economy, then we're still going to have an inequality problem. I'm thinking in particular about a recent study of a digital platform, Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which allocates typically low-paid work to people across the world. And the study found that because of the market power of this platform, because it's so dominant, workers on the platform can receive up to 13% less than what they deserve in compensation based off their measurable productivity. So it's not enough to have, the single moms becoming more productive, but we also need to have a distribution of power within our economy so that people can actually enjoy the fruits of their labor and that income is not extracted from them and going to the 1%.
In our last 30 seconds, Allison, could you weigh in on this issue? If we don't figure this out in a satisfactory way, how concerned are you we're going to see more January 6th type attacks on our political seats of government?
I'm not sure that we're looking at revolution just yet. I think it's more likely that we see 2008 again, because that's the end product, right? Market crash, which wipes out the savings of ordinary households. So I think not solving the big problems now means endless cycles of ordinary households slowly accumulating small savings only to have them wiped out as the wealthy command more and more resources. That's not sustainable. I hope that politicians everywhere understand that that's not the economy that we want and work towards some different model.
Allison, Robin, Michael, thanks so much for joining us on TVO tonight. We've appreciated your participation in this discussion. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.